Between 1939 and 1945, Britain's railways were revolutionized by the war. Secret headquarters had to be equipped, new trains had to be built, and people, weapons, and equipment needed to be moved throughout the country.
And that was the key to the success. Keep the railways working, keep the bombs moving, keep the troops moving, keep everything moving, keep the food supplies moving, and that's what the railways did.
From the start of the conflict, trains moved children by the hundreds to the safety of the countryside, far from the bombs. Throughout the Battle of Britain, they bolstered the war effort and enabled logistical operations that previously were unthinkable.
They often go hour after hour into the dark, and they don't know what lies ahead. It might be an air raid siren, or it might be the platform of the city that they hope to arrive in.
So the railway workers were particularly heroic in the Second World War, where they faced a lot of difficulties in just keeping the railways going, let alone kind of getting killed by enemy attacks and so on.
In the four corners of Europe and throughout the entire Second World War, trains were a strategic weapon at the heart of military operations. Far from the simple means of transportation we know, they met all the logistical needs of troops and civilians under threat during the Battle of Britain. They symbolized the United Kingdom's stability and continuity while facing Nazi Germany. They played the starring role in the little-known story of trains at war. London, 1938. Great Britain, like the rest of Europe, was preparing for war. The posh neighborhood of Mayfair in the heart of London hides one of the best-kept secrets of the British rail power. Behind this ordinary door, a stairway leads to the disused underground station of Down Street.
It was the nerve centre of all the railways operations during the war, and the railways were at the heart of the war effort. Without the railways, we couldn't have won the war.
The abandoned underground station was used as the general headquarters of the Railway Executive Committee, the organization in charge of planning all the strategic railway operations during the war. This ghost station, rediscovered in 1938, was outfitted in just a few nights by engineers tasked with designing a secret area well out of sight from commuters.
They chose it because it was bomb-proof, they thought. It was 100 steps down from the street, and it was perfect because it was a disused station. The problem with a disused station was that the trains still ran through, and you can hear a train coming now. When the members of the Railway Executive Committee wanted to access or come away from this station, they had a secret signal on the platform, and they shone it at the trains, and the driver knew when to stop. And then they had to show a special pass. It was all top secret, and all this was happening without commuters knowing any of this was here.
In these narrow hallways, the committee, comprised of the top railway engineers of the day, set up its offices. From here, countless crucial operations were led, each time mobilizing the country's railways in utmost secrecy.
The wall of the offices, there's the curve of the platform. It's round because that's why London Underground trains are called tubes. And behind here, they had to fit out special furniture because it was all made small because it wouldn't conventionally fit. 22 people worked here, 12 people were able to sleep here. So it was quite a busy place. We couldn't have won the war without this group of people down in this dark area underneath the streets of London in the disused platforms of the Piccadilly line. They were working in the most difficult conditions in this dark, airless space below the streets of London, with the trains rumbling by on the other side of the wall.
Sheltered from the chaos of the capital in the midst of the war, its location made it a refuge for the state's highest authorities.
It was a favourite place of Winston Churchill, our great war leader. Even though he had offices in Whitehall, he would come here to supervise the work of the Railway Executive Committee and to get a bit of peace and quiet, because he had his own location here. He had his own bath, and it was a great place for him to come.
While the committee prepared for war in the bowels of the earth, Londoners above ground were unaware that their daily lives were about to be upended. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's Germany invaded Poland. War was imminent. Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister at the time, gave a solemn radio address 2 days later to announce that Great Britain had entered the war. Practically speaking, in terms of logistics for the upcoming months, this meant transporting more men and more equipment. The British government knew the railways were the key to the war effort throughout the country.
It's difficult to think of this these days, but really the road network, even what we call the A roads, which are the equivalent to the Route Nationale, were in very poor condition. They didn't even have bypasses around towns, so you know, they would go straight through the middle of towns. You know, the road network was really not up to carrying this very heavy material. All that went by rail.
The problem was, at the time, rail traffic was controlled by 4 different large private companies, the Big Four. The Great Western Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, and finally, the Southern Railway. Together, they served the entire country.
They had been formed into these big groups after the First World War because the railways had been very run down during the First World War.
As soon as war was declared in September 1939, within 24 hours, the railways were taken over by the government because they were far too important to be run privately as private businesses. They had to be part of the war effort right from the start.
Fearing the trains and stations would be abandoned and the nightmare of World War I repeated, the government didn't allow railway workers to leave their jobs.
The railway workers were not allowed to sign up to the army except in very exceptional circumstances. They had to work for the railways because it was realized that they were absolutely vital for the war effort. And so then the government could use the railways to transport the troops, to transport goods, to transport the war material when it wanted to. But it was still, and that's very important, run by railway managers who knew how to run the railways. The military can never run the railways.
The Emergency Powers Act, which authorized the government to take emergency measures, allowed them to carry out an initial extraordinary mission that had been planned since 1938 by the Railway Executive Committee. It fell to railway workers to perform the difficult mission of evacuating hundreds of thousands of children from major urban centers, liable to be bombed by the Germans.
Over the space of a few days, 1.3 million young people, mostly children, were evacuated from the big cities to the countryside. The only means of transport there was trains. And the trains radiated out of the cities. It was a perfect form of transport because they radiated out of the big cities into the countryside, and it was the perfect means of getting all these children out of the cities in large numbers.
Operation Pied Piper was an unprecedented railway feat. In London, 1,500 trains were mobilized in a single weekend. No fewer than 98 train stations welcomed the small travelers on the move. A train filled with children left the city every 4 minutes. Every railway worker was called upon to participate. Train stations were bustling.
Getting a railway together is not just about kind of laying down the tracks and putting a locomotive down it with a few wagons at the back. It's a big logistical exercise.
And it was planned with logistical perfection that these people got out. And it was very sad in many ways because tiny children were taken by their parents to the station crying with a label around their neck because it had to be done in such a hurry. They're tiny teddy bears packed in suitcases. It was tragic. Parents were weeping, children had to go on the trains to places hundreds of miles away they'd never been to before.
Those people who stayed as evacuees, and some stayed throughout the war, the experiences could really vary. For some, it was the best years of their lives, and they found it quite difficult to readjust when they went back home at the end of the war. For others who were ill-treated by their foster carers, it was an extremely traumatic experience and took them years to get over it.
The country feared the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, like in Spain a few years earlier. The government launched a major poster campaign to convince parents to put their children on a train and send them to safer places.
Well, I think the main reasons the families accepted evacuation is because of the fear of the bombing. During the 1930s, is one of the huge fears across the culture of the country. I think because of the experiences in places like this, in Spain during the Spanish Civil War and the devastation that the bombing had actually caused. And so this made people willing to accept separation from their children.
The split-up families were given moral support by the royal family back in London. In a radio message given a few months earlier, Princess Elizabeth, just 13 at the time, publicly addressed the country for the first time.
My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all. To you, living in new surroundings, we send a message of true sympathy.
The Railway Executive Committee fulfilled its mission, and Operation Pied Piper was a success that boosted British morale. But the respite was short-lived, because the situation on the continent was getting worse and worse. Across the English Channel, Germany went on the offensive. On May 10, 1940, it invaded Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. That same day, the charismatic and controversial politician Winston Churchill was appointed Prime Minister. The speech he gave left no doubts as to what his fellow countrymen had in store.
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. You ask what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, and with all the strength that God can give us. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs.
The new tenant at 10 Downing Street knew from the start that the battle would be waged largely on the railways.
Churchill really understood the role of the railways, and I think that's because he was a veteran of the First World War, where essentially the First World War was a railway war.
Churchill instinctively understood how important the railways were. When he'd been in South Africa, he'd had an involvement with trains, and he understood that trains were the key. The efficient operation of the railways were the key to the efficient operation of the military. because trains moved things. Trains moved guns, they moved bombs, they moved people, that they operated in a very organised, just like the military, they operated with precision. And he understood the parallel between the way the railways operated with their form of precision and the way that the military operated with its form of precision.
A lesson he would put into practice just a few days after he took the helm of the country. May 27, 1940, the British Army suffered its first setback. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers found themselves trapped by the German army on the beaches of Dunkirk. Churchill, who knew the war was just beginning, wanted to preserve as many troops as he could. Great Britain launched Operation Dynamo, the emergency evacuation of as many soldiers as possible.
Well, when we celebrate the memory of Dunkirk, which was the most amazing operation where vast numbers of people were brought back across the Channel, we think of it in terms of a flotilla of little boats, of brave small boat operators bringing back people at great cost to themselves. But actually, it's a story about the railways.
Behind the well-known naval operation lay another, more secret logistical feat, the mobilization of thousands of trains to transport the defeated soldiers from the British coast back to their homes.
The railways played two important roles in the Battle of Dunkirk. First of all, Hitler did not have the support of the railways area of northern France and northern Belgium, so his advance somewhat ran out of steam, which led to the kind of trapping of all these troops on Dunkirk beaches. And then at the other end, it was really important that once the troops got to Dover and Folkestone and the ports, that they were taken away quickly. Otherwise, the whole area would have been just completely jam-packed and it would have held up the evacuation.
They were demoralised, they were defeated, they were very emotional, and they had to be taken inland to hospitals, to camps, to depots, and they had to be dispersed as quickly as possible away from the ports so more boats could land and more trains could arrive. It was the most amazing logistical operation where train after train arrived at the ports carrying these poor, unfortunate men away.
In just 3 days, 300,000 men were evacuated on board 600 trains.
We hadn't been defeated like that for a long time. We hadn't been chased out of France during the whole of the First World War, and we were chased out of France at Dunkirk. The victory had to be found elsewhere, and it had to be found in things like the smooth operation of the military medical response to the casualties. But people must have known that's a lot of trains with a lot of wounded on them. Things went very badly for us in France.
All along the railways in the villages of southern England, the soldiers were given a hero's welcome.
When the train stopped, they handed out food, as I say, cigarettes, socks, clothes, everything, and tried to provide some sort of comfort to these men.
The local people and the Women's Royal Voluntary Service and all these kind of support organisations came out and gave these soldiers, who were often half-starved, having been stuck on the beaches, cups of tea and buns, and it was a real kind of British kind of effort.
The most seriously wounded soldiers were loaded onto specially equipped trains called ambulance trains or hospital trains. Since the First World War, the British had realized that quick medical attention helped save lives. The question was how to adapt trains to meet the needs of military medicine.
This was, again, another throwback from the First World War, where there were massive numbers of ambulance trains prepared, right behind the front to take people away. And this was replicated in days after the evacuation from Dunkirk by, similar ambulance trains.
We see the idea of the ambulance train as a medical unit in its own right, a mobile medical unit. The wounded soldier whose life has been saved somewhere on the battlefield or very close is loaded onto the ambulance train, where he will receive medical treatment that will keep his life saved. And when he reaches his destination, he doesn't need more treatment. He can go straight into surgery, straight into the operating theatre, or straight into the hospital.
Between the First and Second World Wars, the size of hospital trains practically doubled to accommodate as many wounded as possible.
The length of the train really depended on how many wounded you had and how badly wounded they were, whether they could sit up or whether they were lying down. Because, of course, the carriages that were really like hospital wards, that carried the patients that were bedbound, they couldn't carry nearly as many as the ones that had seats. So it really depended on your wounded. But 15 to 20 carriages, plus kitchen, plus supplies, plus dressing carriages. So you could be looking at a train as long as 30 carriages. The wounds had to be kept very clean, so they needed rooms where patients could be taken, not really to have surgery, because the trains always wobble a little too much for surgery. But they can have their dressings changed, and they can have their wounds cleaned, and they can be kept clean. So the responsibilities are enormous, and we know that ambulance-trained nurses are some of the most remarkable medics in the whole of the war.
Besides hospital trains, the War Department faced an immense challenge. The volume of merchandise increased by 46%. The British launched a vast project of research and development to create a steam locomotive that could meet the needs of transporting troops and heavy merchandise. This was Austerity. Unlike the quest for speed that railway engineers were interested in at the time, the specifications were quite clear. Make them sturdy and, above all, economical.
The costs were reduced in several ways. They used fabrications, for instance, where traditionally there'd have been heavy castings. Castings were both much more expensive and they took longer to produce. And these connecting rods are much lighter and more slender than a traditional one would have been.
The firebox was made of steel rather than copper to save money. Locomotives were equipped with 3 or 4 axle boxes, depending on their size. All of them were painted black during the war. Finally, they were limited to speeds of 50 kilometers per hour.
The use of fabrications had an additional advantage in the design because it made the engine lighter.
Production needed to be launched as quickly as possible, but qualified workers were lacking in the factories as they'd all gone off to war. Engineers had to design a machine that was easier to construct.
It didn't need so much skill to produce it, so the workforce could be expanded to bring less skilled people in to speed up the manufacture and the construction.
Over 900 Austerity locomotives were built by the North British Locomotive Company and Vulcan Foundry starting in 1943. Across the Channel, the French defeat was underway. The Dunkirk debacle heralded the June 22, 1940 surrender of France to Germany. The signing took place in the Compiègne forest, in the same railway carriage where the Germans had signed the 1918 armistice.
Pour les Allemands, le symbole même des wagons-lits, c'est les vainqueurs. Eux, ils sont les vaincus. Et on leur inflige exprès un wagon de la compagnie des wagons-lits, un wagon-salon, on leur inflige ça pour la signature de 1918 dans la clairière de Compiègne. C'est pourquoi, en 1940, la même scène va être reconstituée par un Hitler qui désire absolument avoir ce wagon où il a été humilié.
And so the humiliation of Germany was something that I am sure the Germans remembered while they were fighting in the Second World War.
France was split in two. In the occupied zone, Germany took over all rolling stock. France became the Third Reich's rear base for attacking Great Britain.
Les Allemands n'ont pas détruit le réseau ferré français pour la bonne et simple raison qu'ils en avaient besoin. Leur but pour eux, c'est d'obtenir la France, de l'exploiter. Une France entière, intégrale et entièrement épargnée sur le plan industriel.
All eyes were now on London. Hitler had already set his sights on invading Great Britain. Codename Operation Seelöwe, Sea Lion in English. Before setting foot on the island, Hitler sent Goering's Luftwaffe to conquer the airspace. The Battle of Britain had begun. On July 10, Junker dive bombers and Messerschmitt fighter planes set off to conquer the United Kingdom. Though the battle took place in the air, the British war effort itself happened on the railways to keep the planes of the Royal Air Force supplied with bombs and ammunition.
And that was the key to the success. Keep the railways working, keep the bombs moving, keep the troops moving, keep everything moving, keep the food supplies moving, and that's what the railways did.
I mean, thanks to the railways, food supplies were still available, the munitions were still getting to the ports and wherever they needed to be taken, and very important, still in those days, coal was the main way that people got their heating. And so the railways played a role in every aspect of British life, and putting them out of action would really have destroyed the whole morale of the country.
While the entire country was suffering under the intense bombings, railway workers were more indispensable than ever. They conducted themselves like heroes and were exposed to enemy fire.
At the beginning of the war, the instruction was that if the Germans were attacking, all trains were supposed to stop. But actually, this rather proved counterproductive because it was quite easy to spot trains from the air, even at night, because of the flames in the fire.
It was very difficult for the railway workers. These weren't soldiers, but they were almost doing a job that was as dangerous as the soldiers. First of all, they had to operate in the blackout, which was during the station lights had to be turned off, the signals had to be muted. It's very dangerous driving a train at night when you can't see, and these drivers had to chase through the night on their trains and not, with the risk of falling into a crater. If a bomb dropped in front of a train, the driver wouldn't necessarily know it's happened.
At night, in order to run the trains as secretly as possible and save their own lives, railway workers came up with clever ideas to hide them.
The driver on this locomotive on the right-hand side, so this is the driver's position. And the fireman over on this side here, his job, as well as looking after the fire, during the war, because of the danger from attack by enemy aircraft, the light emitted by the fire had to be actually covered in as best as possible. So the locomotive's cab windows would all be filled with wood, and the tender and the cab would have a large sheet between to enforce, as far as was possible, a blackout and limit the exposure of light. The ventilating space would also have been filled over to actually restrict the amount of light that could be seen by an aircraft. But it also restricts the amount of air so that you don't get very much ventilation.
Thanks to the railway workers' skills, very few locomotives were destroyed by German bombs. But on the rails, military convoys and passenger trains followed one after the other, vying for space. How to adapt the stations and trains to the considerable spike in traffic. Faced with an increased need for personnel, new faces were called in to join the ranks of the railway workers. Numerous women stepped forth to apply.
People recognised that the railway was a very important part of society, and a job on the railways was regarded as a job for life. And there was something called the railway family, which meant that if your father worked on the railways, he was likely to be able to get you a job, and possibly your uncle or whatever. So it's a very important concept. And most of the women that were recruited during the war got jobs fairly easily because somebody in the family put a word in for them.
Between 1941 and 1944, the percentage of women working on the railways was multiplied by 3 to hit 15%.
And it was a great liberation for women. Lots of women They came into their own during this time because they saw it was a great opportunity for them to do a job which they knew they could do and which had been denied to them.
Recruited at first in the same positions that they'd previously held, women were quickly employed to do tasks formerly reserved for men who were now off at war.
Women took over many of the jobs, and they took over many of the backroom jobs like collecting tickets or operating the signals, operating level crossings and so on.
In the early 1940s, it became apparent that the railway companies were really short of workers in porters, but eventually guards. And this is where there was a bit of a conflict with men, because traditionally in peacetime, a man would take a long time to train up from being a porter to a guard. And now, in wartime, we've got 17-year-old women undergoing a few weeks' training and then becoming a guard.
At the time, despite the great need for workers, the unions opposed letting women access the most prestigious positions.
There was always this uneasy feeling that it was important, obviously, to protect the way that men were able to work in the railway industry. And certainly the men had gone off to fight for the country, but there was always the concept that when they came back, those jobs would be there for them.
The one job they never did was to drive the trains or to be a fireman. All trains had two people, one driving the train and one being the fireman stoking the coal. A very heavy, very difficult job, and women never actually undertook that.
For some, the experience was a revelation, even if many of them were pushed to leave the railway to found a family after the war.
By the end of the war, women felt that these jobs were really interesting. It gave them a sense of responsibility. They learned new skills. They were working outdoors quite often, which was better than being stuck in a house doing the washing, although they still had to do that when they got back. So they got a tremendous amount of enjoyment out of working for the railways during the war.
While rail workers contended as best as they could with the bombings throughout the country, the Royal Air Force battled Hitler and jeopardized his plans to invade Great Britain. By late summer 1940, Hitler sensed he was losing control and shifted tactics. He sent the Luftwaffe to bombard civilians in order to drain their morale. In the early hours of September 7, 350 bombers and 600 fighter planes flew over the Thames. The London Blitz had begun. As the first siren sounded, frightened Londoners all had the same reflex: head for shelter in the underground, which seemed their best chance of survival. Some families would begin queuing in the early afternoon to purchase tickets that would let them escape the Nazi bombs for a few hours.
The London Underground played an absolutely crucial role in the Blitz because people obviously saw it as a wonderful shelter, as a way of protecting themselves against the bombs. And so they naturally started going to the underground and trying to stay the night there.
Initially, this wasn't condoned by the tube authorities. They didn't want people to go because obviously it got in the way of running the trains. But eventually, so many people wanted to shelter in the tube that they had to give in and they sold tickets.
In the fall of 1940, bombings happened almost every night. German bombers targeted the most popular neighborhoods of the city, such as the East End, to spread terror. At the height of the attacks, a total of 380 tons of bombs, including 70,000 incendiary bombs, were dropped on London in a single night.
But of course, there are no toilets down there, and so the sanitary facilities had to be kind of adopted. There's no food down there, so they had to start bringing in special trains, and people were allowed to start going down there about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the evening while there were still other people using it. And people were very keen to get their particular spot and get somewhere where there was a chance of a good night's sleep.
Thousands and thousands of people were sheltering in the tubes. I mean, it's not to say that it was perfect, but it was as best we could get. And there was a great atmosphere in the tube stations. They played chess, they set up libraries, they set up children's creches, all sorts of things. They founded community groups. It was a great sense of community, and people got to know each other.
And although the stories about it are that everybody was very jolly and cheerful and that it was all kind of great fun, certainly that might have been the case in some instances, but it was also quite difficult, and sometimes fights erupted over spaces, and it was by no means kind of all entirely fun and games.
In the morning, Londoners would emerge to take in the damage. The city was ravaged. Entire buildings were destroyed. The streets covered in ash. After the bombs, the locals were left to fight the flames. More than 1.5 million people were left homeless. 12,000 Londoners lost their lives in the Blitz. One day is remembered as a particularly dark one for the capital's train stations. On May 11, 1941, the Luftwaffe had already lost a quarter of its number, and Hitler knew the end was near. All night long, planes kept returning to bomb the city. The bombs pummeled the city and targeted the capital's major train stations.
In May 1941, there was one night where all the main railway stations were targeted, and I suspect this was on purpose. That 7 or 8 of the main railway stations. London has a dozen major railway stations, more than any other town, more than even in Paris. And most of these were attacked on that one night. So it was clear that this was the Luftwaffe attempt to try and destroy the rail network right at its heart.
London's major railway stations were targeted: King's Cross, Paddington, Victoria, Waterloo, not to mention St. Pancras.
There was a terrible, terrible wave of bombing of all these beautiful stations. This St. Pancras, where we are now, is the most beautiful of them all. And the bombs hit this lovely roof here, which in its day was the largest single-span roof in the world. They fell through the roof, where we could just see over there behind the train, into the bottom of the station and destroyed everything. The bombs smashed the station. It was terrible.
The rails were destroyed, the entrances to the station blocked. But railway engineers were ready to act quickly. They got to work in record time to get the trains running again.
Within a week, it was back to normal. The station was running again. One of the great tributes I think we must pay to all the people who worked on the railways during the war were the civil engineers who came along and repaired the stations and made the railways run again.
The Luftwaffe didn't meet their goal. In less than a month, the London traffic was back to normal.
They didn't manage to put out of action the railways, which was very important for the morale of the British people as well.
London wasn't the only British city to pay a heavy price during the Blitz. Everywhere in the country, the never-ending bombs marked people's minds and worried inhabitants. In a show of support and to bring royal comfort to Britons, King George VI himself traveled the country by train.
Because of the war, special permission was given to build a set of coaches to transport the royal family safely with armour plating, so they could get around the country to see the devastation in the cities and meet the people safely themselves.
Like every sovereign, he had his own royal train that could safely accommodate himself and his family for trips lasting several days.
The coach originally was protected by armour over the roof and down the sides. Also, the windows had shuttering to stop any shrapnel or whatever from bombs that went off nearby and keep the royal family safe.
On board this train, George VI traveled to Coventry, Liverpool, and Plymouth. The trips were always risky and planned in utmost secrecy.
The movements of the train were kept highly secret right up until the last minute, obviously so that no one could target the king. But once the route was set, the railway did all it could to make this the absolute priority train on its route. They had a special head code that showed to everyone the fact that the king was on board and it was the royal train. Many important meetings, we believe, took place here, obviously for reasons of secrecy. We don't know exact details, but it is believed that he met with Churchill, Roosevelt, Eisenhower and General de Gaulle during the war to get various updates on how the campaign was going.
The British kept their morale and remained united behind their king and their prime minister. By spring 1941, although he may have kept it to himself, Hitler knew he'd lost the Battle of Britain. At last, on May 21st, the Blitz ended.
You know, without the railways, it's very difficult to see how Britain would have survived, both in terms of getting food to people and getting supplies, but also in terms of the war effort.
Yet history could have easily turned to Hitler's advantage if he'd only realized from the start the importance of the major rail lines.
If the railway system had been put out of action, if Hitler had kind of targeted the railways and said, right, we're going to wreck the railways, then he might well have kind of managed to conquer Britain in a way that proved impossible, that he never really attempted it because the railways were still functioning.
Because don't forget, it was about keeping the trains running that was important. It wasn't so much about destroying things, it was keeping those supply lines open that was important to us. Hitler didn't stop that. He didn't stop the railways. The railways kept on running all through the war. No matter how bad the bombing was in certain places, it was repaired very quickly.
In October 1941, Operation Sea Lion was officially postponed. The Germans didn't manage to invade Great Britain. For Churchill, it was a first victory, a victory that rested largely on his adept and visionary use of the railways.
There was a great sense of what the railways had done, and Churchill wrote to the railway workers. He wrote a letter to them, and he said that, you know, you've done this amazing, heroic job for which I give you my gratitude.
400 men and women rail workers gave their lives to maintain the war effort and stand up to Hitler's bombs. It is largely thanks to them that Great Britain won the battle and then the war.
It was a profound thing that they had died or become injured because they were not soldiers. They were not conscripted to fight the war. They were working on the home front. They were just ordinary people who served the public, who did a great job keeping Britain moving during the war.